Have you ever stopped to think that without a man hiding behind smoke and hot iron, perhaps the Middle Ages would simply have collapsed? Strange, isn't it? We tend to think of kings, knights, and epic battles, but we rarely think of the man who, with a hammer and anvil, sustained the life of an entire village. Well, yes, the blacksmith was the true heart of the village, even without titles, crowns, or glory. And here's the kicker: his work was as essential as it was invisible. Without tools, there was no harvest. Without horseshoes, there was no transportation. Without keys, there was no security. And yet, history has almost forgotten him. This raises an uncomfortable question. How many everyday heroes also go unnoticed today? Get ready, because on this journey, you won't hear about kings and wars, but about the man who turned fire into survival. We'll delve into a world of smoke, hammers, patience, and tradition. You'll discover how every detail of a medieval blacksmith's life holds lessons for us, who live amidst so much technology, yet still depend on the same human foundations: work, trust, and community. Before we begin, I want you to tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there now? I'd love to know who's joining me on this time travel. Back then, in a small medieval village, there was always one figure who stood out with the rhythmic sound of his hammer echoing in the air: the blacksmith. He wasn't a nobleman, nor a prestigious warrior, but his presence was indispensable. Every door that closed, every hoe that turned the earth, every horseshoe that supported a horse bore the discreet mark of his hands. It was curious to see how someone so hidden behind the smoke of the forge could still keep the pulse of the community. The blacksmith didn't work for luxury, but for survival. While peasants tended the harvest and shepherds herded their flocks, he shaped raw iron, giving life to tools that guaranteed daily bread. Think about it today. If a knife loses its edge, it's just a quick run to the supermarket. In those days, the village depended solely on that man to restore its edge. And this gave him a silent, almost invisible relevance, but one that sustained every meal served on the wooden tables. Respect for the blacksmith wasn't expressed in applause, but in dependence. He was the one they turned to when the plow broke the day before planting, when the lock on a chest stuck, or when the nail holding the roof loose in the rain. Curiously, his centrality in the village was similar to the role of the internet in our lives. No one talks about it every day, but if it's absent, the world crumbles into silence. This contrast shows how some functions, invisible at first glance, are actually the foundations of the whole. There was also a question of trust. The blacksmith knew all the residents, knowing who needed urgent repairs and who could wait a little longer. He was both a craftsman and an informal advisor. Many, when bringing a scythe to be repaired, took the opportunity to chat, ask for opinions, and share life's worries. Ultimately, the workshop was not just a workspace, it was a meeting place where iron and words were forged side by side. This central role of the blacksmith reminds us how, in any era, there are always people who carry more than their own tasks on their shoulders. Think, for example, of those who keep the gears of today's city running: the neighborhood mechanic, the electrician who fixes a short circuit, the baker who opens before sunrise. They all play seemingly modest roles, but without them, everyday life would be chaos. And it is precisely this comparison that makes us appreciate the greatness that lies in the ordinary. But not everything was just respect and usefulness. The blacksmith, though central, lived on the margins of greater recognition. He had no titles, did not sit at the master's table, and his work was heavy, exhausting and repetitive. It was as if he carried a kind of paradox, fundamental yet forgotten. This detail opens the door to understanding not only his workshop, but also the instruments that filled that space with smoke and rhythm. After all, what tools sustained so much effort? The medieval blacksmith's workshop was nothing grand. It was, in essence, a small space with beaten earth walls and a wooden structure that creaked in the wind. It bore no resemblance to today's large industries. On the contrary, the place seemed more like a makeshift shelter, often dark and sooty. Its simplicity, however, hid its depth. It was in this modest setting that the pieces that sustained the village's life were created. The floor was packed earth, marked by old footprints and charcoal stains. Upon entering, visitors were struck by the strong smell of smoke mixed with the heat of the constant fire. There was no luxury, but there was utility in every corner: a worn bench, a bucket of water, scattered tools, and the inevitable bellows, the oven's inseparable companion. Curiously, this humble space served the purpose of an entire factory, but on an almost artisanal scale. For those accustomed to modern workshops brimming with machinery, it would be a shock to realize how much was accomplished with so little. Imagine comparing today's carpenter, his electric drills, precision saws, and vacuum cleaners. Back then, the blacksmith relied solely on the strength of his arms and the ingenuity accumulated over generations. This shows how an excess of resources often weakens our creativity, while scarcity forces intelligence to flourish. The workshop environment also played a psychological role. The sound of the hammer mixed with the blowing of the bellows created a kind of repetitive soundtrack. To some, it seemed boring. To others, it was almost hypnotic. It was in this setting that apprentices grew, absorbing their master's slow, methodical movements. With each crackle of the fire, they learned not only about metal, but also about patience, discipline, and resilience to discomfort. It's worth noting that the workshop was also a reflection of the community that maintained it. If the village was poor, the workshop was even more precarious. If there was some active trade, perhaps the blacksmith could reinforce the walls or expand the space. Thus, the workshop was not just a place of work, it was a mirror of collective development. Anyone who entered that space could, in a way, perceive the general state of the village. And within this almost unpretentious simplicity, an inevitable question arose. How were so many pieces, so fundamental to medieval life, produced in such a rudimentary place? It is here that our eyes turn to the true star of the workshop, the anvil, always at the center, solid, immobile, awaiting the next blow of the hammer. The anvil was, without exaggeration, the beating heart of the blacksmith's workshop. Large, heavy, and immobile, it occupied the center of the space, like a silent throne. There was nothing sophisticated about it, just a solid block of iron, with smooth surfaces and angles calculated for different functions. Yet it was on it that all the work took place. Each hammer blow echoed not only through the metal, but also through the village, reminding everyone that life was still in motion. It's curious to think that, while today we have computers, software, and 3D printers to create objects, back then everything boiled down to this rudimentary partnership. Hammer, the anvil was like a stage, and the incandescent metal was the main actor, molded into scenes repeated every day. This image shows that simplicity, when used masterfully, can produce extraordinary results. It wasn't uncommon for an anvil to be passed down from generation to generation. Unlike smaller tools which wore out quickly, it withstood the test of time and continued use. Imagine the symbolic power of this. A son inherited the same surface marked by the blows of his father and grandfather. Each scar on the iron was a silent memory of the village's struggles, wars, harvests, and conquests. It was in a way an open book, written not with ink, but with strokes. And there's a practical reflection here. How often do we disregard objects that last, preferring disposable ones? While in the Middle Ages, an anvil could last centuries, today we barely remember the cell phone we used 2 years ago. This contrast shows how our relationship with time and consumption has transformed. Perhaps there's something valuable in reclaiming this respect for what endures, for what endures. Furthermore, the anvil had an almost pedagogical role. By watching the master work on it, the apprentice learned not only how to shape metal, but also how to understand the rhythm of life: heat, beat, cool, repeat. It was a constant, predictable cycle that taught discipline. Many apprentices carried these lessons even outside the workshop, applying them to other aspects of life, such as caring for their families or patience in the face of difficulties. And yet, despite its importance, the anvil didn't work alone. For it to fulfill its function, another vital element was needed: the bellows, which kept the fire alive and transformed simple embers into a flame capable of bending the strongest iron. The bellows was one of those tools that seemed insignificant at first glance, but without it, nothing happened. Made of wood and leather, simple in design but fundamental in purpose, to blow constant air to feed the flame. And since the flame was the soul of the forge, one could say the bellows were practically an artificial lung for the workshop. Each slow, repetitive movement made the fire breathe, and the blacksmith knew that if the fire died, the whole day was lost. The blacksmith's life revolved around this detail, keeping the flame alive. Today, all it takes is the turn of a knob on the stove to create an instant fire. But imagine relying on heavy manual equipment that required strength and coordination just to ensure the work could begin. The apprentice was usually responsible for this task. Hours and hours of pulling and pushing the bellows, without glamour, without recognition, but with the responsibility of sustaining the entire process. The sound of the bellows also had a distinctive quality. It was a deep, repetitive breath, blending with the crackling of the wood and the hiss of the heating metal. Many villagers recognized this rhythm from afar and knew the blacksmith was hard at work. It was almost like the noise of a modern city. Just as traffic signals movement, the bellows marked the rhythm of the village. It was a constant reminder that someone was there, working in the sweltering heat. It's interesting to consider how this detail connects to modern life. How often today do we have our own manual breaths, repetitive, unglamorous tasks that nevertheless keep our lives running, paying bills, organizing papers, answering emails? No one applauds these moments, but without them, nothing greater can be sustained. The bellows is a reminder that the extraordinary always depends on ordinary routine. Working with the bellows also fostered a bond of patience and humility. Many young men, eager to wield the hammer, had to spend years simply fueling the fire. It was a silent school of perseverance. Those who didn't master constancy with the bellows would have a hard time mastering the iron. It's like saying before shaping the world, learn to keep the flame burning. And that, let's face it, applies to any stage of life. But the flame, even if constant, needed fuel, and without charcoal, no bellows would have enough power to turn the fire into a forge. It was this, obtained through hard work, that ensured the continuity of the work, and therefore of the village itself. Charcoal was, in fact, the silent foundation of all the blacksmith's production. Without it, the fire would not reach the temperature necessary to soften the raw iron. It was produced by slowly burning wood in improvised furnace, a long and laborious process. The smell of charcoal had something distinctive about it, strong, penetrating, and it impregnated the clothes of those who handled it. In the village, everyone knew that the blacksmith could never work without this simple yet vital resource. Obtaining charcoal was no trivial task. Often the blacksmith himself had to negotiate with lumberjacks or farmers who had access to wood. It was a game of addiction. Without charcoal, there were no tools. Without tools, there was no harvest. This cycle made it clear how everything was interconnected. Today, we have electricity available with a simple click. But back then, the entire community depended on the black smoke rising from the furnaces to keep them running. Charcoal also held a lesson in patience. Its production required carefully stacking the wood, covering it, and burning it for days until only the black light pieces remained. It was necessary to wait for the right time without rushing or risk losing all the material. This waiting, in a way, resembled the processes of life. Often, to achieve a solid result, it is necessary to endure slowness. The blacksmith knew this better than anyone. It's interesting to consider the contrast with the present. Today, a modern factory can operate 24 hours a day, powered by constant electricity. The medieval blacksmith, however, had to deal with scarcity. If it rained heavily, waterlogged wood made charcoal production difficult. If there was a drought, the search for firewood became even more arduous. Thus, each blow of the hammer on the anvil invisibly carried the collective effort that went from gathering the wood to slowly burning it. And there was the practical detail. Charcoal produced a clean, concentrated heat, unlike regular firewood, which gave off unpredictable sparks. Therefore, it was safer and more efficient for shaping iron. This mastery of the fuel was almost as important as mastery of the tools. After all, what good would a hammer and anvil be without a flame capable of transforming the metal? The flame, in fact, wasn't just heat, it was pure transformation, almost magical in the village's eyes. But iron, even heated by coal, still had its limits. The alloys available at the time were imperfect, fragile compared to modern metals. This constant challenge was part of the blacksmith's daily routine, needing to extract maximum efficiency from what he had at hand. The medieval blacksmith faced a constant dilemma. The iron he forged was never completely pure. The metal alloys of the time were full of impurities, fragile and unpredictable. Sometimes a plowshare might seem perfect when it left the anvil, but upon first intense use, it would shatter into pieces. This limitation was known to all, yet the village still depended on these imperfect pieces. It was like building the future on a clay floor, functional, but always unstable. This detail reminds us of how, in the past, perfection wasn't an expectation. People knew everything had a short shelf life. Tools broke, nails bent, horseshoes came loose. The blacksmith, then, needed not only to manufacture, but also to always be available to repair. Today, when something breaks, we seek warranty coverage or buy a new product. Back then, repairs were the norm, and durability was a distant illusion. There was also the blacksmith, silent frustration. Imagine the effort of spending hours hammering, heating, and cooling a piece of iron, only to see it fail in the field. It was like studying for a test and forgetting everything when it was time. But this reality also forced the artisan to seek creative solutions, reinforcing strategic points, using thicker layers, inventing tricks to extend the object's lifespan. Limitations became an incentive for ingenuity. The apprentice, observing all this, learned a valuable lesson. It wasn't the material that determined the result, but the skill in handling it. This lesson still holds true today. How often do we complain about a lack of resources, when in fact the challenge is precisely the opportunity to practice our skills? Many great businesses began in cramped garages with precarious tools. The same was true of the village's iron, limited but full of potential for those who knew how to exploit it. And there was the inevitable contrast with the present. Today we have stainless steel, lightweight and durable alloys used even in airplanes. Back then, the simple act of making a straight nail was already a victory. This comparison helps us appreciate how far humanity has come, but also realizes that despite their limitations, the blacksmiths of that time sustained entire generations. Their failures, in a way, were part of the process of evolution. Yet, despite all these difficulties, there were parts that were manufactured on a large scale, repeated so often that they became indispensable to everyday life. And among them was something seemingly small, but without which no construction would stand. The nail. The nail, so commonplace today, was a true treasure in medieval life. Small, almost invisible, but absolutely indispensable. The blacksmith spent hours shaping these tiny pieces of iron, one by one, beating and cooling them until they reached the right shape. Without nails, doors wouldn't close, roofs wouldn't stay afloat, and carts wouldn't stay steady. It was curious to see how something so modest could support the entire structure of the village. Each nail required patience. Unlike modern machines that produce thousand seconds, the blacksmith shaped each piece by hand, adjusting the size according to need. There were short nails for furniture, long ones for beams, and thicker ones for gates. This variety was part of the daily routine at the forge, and each strike on the heated metal recalled the effort hidden behind each simple construction in the village. Producing nails also had an economic dimension. They were often used as currency in local trades. It was common for farmers to hand over grain or milk in exchange for a small box of nails. Think about it, something we buy in cheap packages at the market today had a value almost equivalent to gold in terms of utility back then. It was a silent symbol of prosperity. It's interesting to note how the blacksmith unwittingly became one of the invisible pillars of medieval civil construction. Every house built, every stable reinforced, every chest locked, depended on his nail. If you look at your own house now, you'll realize the irony. Hundreds of nails hold it upright, yet you hardly think about them. The same was true in the village, an invisible labor, but without which nothing stood. And then there was the issue of scarcity. Nails were reused whenever possible. When a house was dismantled, people carefully removed each one to repurpose it. Today, we discard them without thinking, but back then, every nail had a story. You might have held up a barn door before repairing the roof of a new house. This reusing mentality shows how much the community valued what they had. But the blacksmith didn't stop at driving nails. His work extended to the fields, creating and repairing agricultural tools that ensured the village's livelihood. And it was here that his importance became even more evident, for without proper harvesting tools, there would be no bread on the table. Life in the countryside depended entirely on the tools forged in the blacksmith's workshop. Hoes, sickles, and plows were like extensions of the peasants' hands. Without them, the land remained hard, crops meager, and survival threat. The blacksmith knew that with each blow on his anvil, he was preparing not just an object, but the very fate of the village. His work had repercussions in the fields, in the barns, and even on the dinner tables. Hoes, for example, required balance, neither too heavy to tire the peasant, nor too light to lose efficiency. The blacksmith learned this by observing, listening to complaints, and adjusting his technique. Sickles, on the other hand, had a calculated curvature which determined the speed of the cut. It was a rudimentary science, but full of practical wisdom. Today we call it ergonomics. Back then, it was simply the craftsman's sensitivity to understanding the needs of the people. It's interesting to consider that just as we now change our cell phones every 2 years, peasants needed to constantly replace or repair their tools. Iron wore out quickly, especially in rocky soil. Therefore, the blacksmith was seen as an essential cog in the social machine. Without him, work would stop, and when work stopped, hunger would knock. The sound of the anvil, therefore, was more than just noise. It was a sign that the future of the harvest was being secured. This dynamic also created a relationship of mutual trust. The peasant knew his livelihood was in the hands of the blacksmith, and the blacksmith knew his survival depended on the peasant's harvest. It was a cycle of silent cooperation. Today, we can think of something similar in the relationship between modern farmers and tractor manufacturers. Without the machine, there is no harvest. Without the harvest, there is no fuel to run the machine. The logic at its core remains the same. And there was a curious detail. Many blacksmiths developed small signatures on their tools, discrete marks that distinguished them from other artisans. It was as if each hoe or sickle carried a little piece of its creator's identity. Whoever received one of these pieces knew they were in good hands. This practice is very reminiscent of the brands we carry on clothing or electronics today, except that back then, the signature was engraved by fire and sweat. But beyond working the land, there was another essential job that directly linked the blacksmith to the village's livelihood, caring for the animals. This primarily meant making and maintaining the horseshoes that allowed the horses to endure long work days. In the Middle Ages, the horse was more than just an animal. It was a source of labor, transportation, and often a lifelong companion. But without horseshoes, its hooves wore out quickly on the dirt, stone, and mud. The blacksmith then took on the task of crafting and adjusting each iron piece that would protect the animal. It was meticulous work, demanding precision, and any error could jeopardize not only the horse's health, but also the livelihood of the family that depended on it. Maintenance wasn't limited to ironing hooves. It was necessary to observe the animal, understand its gait, and correct any deformities. The blacksmith became almost a makeshift veterinarian, alert for signs of pain or discomfort. Imagine a limping horse. It meant delays in harvesting, difficulty transporting firewood, or even risk in times of war. Each well-placed horseshoe was a silent guarantee of the continuity of village life. The process itself had a distinctive rhythm. The horse was restrained, the hoof lifted, and the blacksmith calmly removed the old horseshoe. The smell of heated iron mingled with the strong odor of the hoof burning slightly as the hot iron touched the surface to shape it. This detail, though unpleasant, was necessary for firmness. The sound of nails being hammered into the hoof completed the scene, creating a symphony that every villager recognized from afar. It's curious to think that back then, a shod horse was a symbol of progress, while some peasants still relied solely on human strength. Those with well cared for animals advanced faster. This difference is very reminiscent of today's unequal access to technology. Those with good digital tools advance quickly, those without move more slowly. The blacksmith, in this sense, was a true facilitator of opportunities, far beyond the forge. And it wasn't just maintenance. Often the blacksmith had to improvise, creating different horseshoes for different terrains, stronger ones for rocky ground, lighter ones for long distances. This adaptation demonstrated his ability to think beyond the obvious. It was a kind of innovation within simplicity. And in a way, this skill set ordinary blacksmiths apart from those more respected by the community. But horses weren't the only ones to benefit from the blacksmith's work. His hands also shaped items that ensured safety and protection in villages. Gates, locks, and iron doors that became barriers against the unexpected. Iron gates and doors were not luxury items in medieval villages, but rather a basic security necessity. Wood, used in most buildings, could easily be broken into or burnt. Iron, however, even in its simple and heavy form, offered a solid barrier against invaders, wild animals, or even malicious neighbors. When crafting these structures, the blacksmith knew he was creating more than just objects. He was erecting invisible walls of protection. The work required redoubled effort. Unlike making nails or horseshoes, building a door or gate meant handling large, heavy, and difficult to handle iron plates. The metallic sound of hammering echoed louder than usual, and the heat of the forge seemed to intensify under such pressure. Often helpers were needed simply to support the piece during the process. The end result, however, conveyed robustness and grandeur. These simple doors carried a particular symbolism. For the family who received them, it was like putting on a suit of armor in their own home. The crisp sound of closing them brought tranquility, as if an invisible shield had been erected between home and the outside world. And curiously, that same feeling remains alive today when we turn the key in our house's lock. The sense of security hasn't changed, only the material that supports it. It's worth noting that the manufacture of these pieces was also limited by available resources. There wasn't always enough iron for complete doors. Sometimes the blacksmith had to settle for creating metal reinforcements applied to the wood. It was a constant balance between necessity and scarcity, and even these partial solutions made a huge difference as they discouraged break-in attempts. The simple metallic gleam of a lock could signify protection. This role of the blacksmith reminds us how the concept of security has always been part of humanity. Today we have alarms, cameras, and electronic gates. In the past, trust rested on the work of a man who forged iron with fire. This continuous line shows how the desire for protection is universal and timeless. It's a quest that manifests itself in different ways, but always stems from the same human need to protect what we love. And the workshop wasn't just about doors. The community also depended on the blacksmith to maintain another delicate aspect of medieval life: rudimentary weapons, which needed to be ready not only for hunting, but also for the inevitable conflicts that plagued villages and borders. In medieval villages, war was never as far away as one would like. Conflicts between neighbors, territorial disputes, and even raids by looters were constant threats. In this scenario, the blacksmith assumed another vital responsibility: maintaining weapons, swords, Spears, arrowheads, and axes passed through his hands for repairs and adjustments. He wasn't a soldier, but without him, no soldier could fight. He was the invisible pillar of collective defense. Weapons were rarely luxurious. Unlike the ornate swords of the nobles, those circulating through the village were simple, made to withstand harsh and repetitive use. Even so, they broke, bent, and lost their edge. The blacksmith had to be constantly ready to restore even a modicum of efficiency. Imagine the responsibility. A mistake in sharpening a sword could mean life or death on the battlefield. It was a silent but inevitable burden. It's interesting to note how this role brought both prestige and fear. The blacksmith had direct access to what gave power to the warriors. In some villages, this generated respect. In others, distrust. After all, whoever mastered iron controlled, in a sense, the fate of all. This paradox made the blacksmith a figure both valued and guarded, as if carrying a dangerous secret between his fire-scorched hands. This reality can be compared to the present. Consider, for example, engineers who create cyber defense software. They don't make headlines, they don't wield weapons, but without them, entire countries would be vulnerable. The medieval blacksmith played a similar role. He wasn't on the battlefield, but his workshop was the true backstage, where the war began to be decided. This comparison helps understand their relevance beyond the end, and there was also the emotional aspect. For many young warriors, taking their first sword to the blacksmith was almost a rite of passage. The craftsman, calmly and with an experienced eye, would adjust the blade, reinforce the handle, and teach how to care for the weapon. It was more than a repair, it was a transfer of practical wisdom and responsibility. The young man left not only with sharpened iron, but with a lesson etched in his memory. Still, weapons work was only part of his routine. Most of the time, the workshop was filled with another scene, far less heroic but equally striking, the long process of heating the metal until it yielded to the hammer. This repetitive, though tiring, ritual was the heart of the craft. Patience was one of the blacksmith's greatest virtues, and nothing demonstrated this better than the time it took to heat the metal. There were no shortcuts. The raw iron had to remain in the fire until it reached the precise color that indicated the right temperature. This process could take long minutes, sometimes almost an hour, depending on the size of the piece. All the while, the blacksmith watched intently, as if guarding a secret in transformation. The fire, fueled by charcoal and bellows, was the ultimate judge of time. The blacksmith had no thermometers or modern sensors. His only recourse was experience, his trained eye for when the orange-red glow became intense enough. Rushing could ruin everything. Iron that was too cold cracked under the hammer. Iron that was too hot became brittle. Thus, the workshop's rhythm was dictated by the slow rhythm of the flame. This detail reminds us of how accustomed we are to haste. Today, we want everything fast. Food, answers, results. But in the medieval forge, haste had no place. One had to wait for things to take their natural course. Trust the process. Respect the fire. This forced patience shaped not only the iron, but also the blacksmith's character. He learned, day after day, that time is as important an ingredient as the metal itself. During this waiting period, the workshop was not silent. The crackling of the wood, the blowing of the bellows, and the soft hiss of the coals created a kind of continuous soundtrack. For the apprentices, it was an invitation to contemplation. Many took advantage of these moments to listen to the master's stories, learn tricks, or even reflect on life. It was as if the fire were also a teacher, teaching them how to endure boredom and transform monotony into learning. Interestingly, the same logic can be applied today. Think, for example, about slow cooking a dish instead of using the microwave. The flavor is different, deeper, more distinctive. The same was true with iron. The waiting time was part of the quality of the result. And perhaps this is the great lesson the blacksmith would leave us with if he were among us. Sometimes, what seems like a waste of time is precisely what gives strength and consistency to what we are creating. And when the metal finally reached the right temperature, came the most striking stage of the entire process, the repetitive and almost hypnotic sound of the hammer striking, shaping the iron until it was transformed into something useful for the village. The sound of hammer against anvil was the village's soundtrack. Beat after beat, the blacksmith shaped the red-hot iron, repeating movements that always seemed the same, but were never quite the same. There was rhythm to it, almost like a monotonous song that echoed throughout the community. To many, it was noise. To the blacksmith, it was the secret language of the work. Each blow had intention. Each echo was part of the transformation. Repetition, far from being merely tiring, was also a learning experience. The apprentice who held the smaller hammer, imitating the master, soon realized that strength wasn't enough. Cadence, firmness, and patience were required. Hammering iron was like writing words on a blank page. A single poorly drawn letter could ruin the entire sentence. Thus, each blow was considered, even when it seemed automatic. The iron obeyed only those who knew how to communicate with it. This process also shaped the mind. Hours and hours of repeating the same gestures taught something profound about resilience. The blacksmith learned to persist even when it seemed like nothing was changing. Interestingly, the same thing happens today with anyone who practices a musical instrument or trains in a sport. Exhaustive repetition is not a burden, but the only path to mastery. Iron, in this sense, was simply a mirror of life itself. There was also the physical aspect. The blacksmith's arm grew stronger over time, but it also bore the marks of fatigue and persistent pain. The body paid the price of repetition. Still, there was no choice. Each useful piece required hundreds, sometimes thousands of blows. It's like the modern world, where long projects require small, continuous actions, repeated ad nauseum, but which in the end builds something solid. The hammer teaches that consistency trumps hate, and if the apprentice complained about the monotony, the master would quickly remind him it is at this rhythm that the iron bends. It was a reminder that even the greatest transformations happen in small, repeated gestures. This lesson spanned generations, forming not only good blacksmiths, but also people capable of facing life without giving up at the first hurdle. And perhaps that's why, even today, the metallic sound of a hammer carries with it an aura of persistence. But the workshop wasn't just about sound. While the hammer echoed, there was also the constant presence of smoke and stifling heat, a reminder that shaping iron came at a price in discomfort and sacrifice. The blacksmith's workshop was a heavy environment, and smoke was as much a part of the scene as the anvil. Coming from the burning coals, it spread throughout the small space, impregnating the walls, clothes, and even the artisan's skin. The smell was strong, dense, and seemed to follow the blacksmith even when he left. There was no escape. The smoke was a daily reminder that work had a physical, invisible price. For the apprentices, the smoke was a constant challenge. Their eyes stung, their throats burned, and they often had to stop work to breathe better. Today, we talk about protective masks or ventilation system. Back then, however, there was no choice. Enduring the thick air was part of the training. It was almost an initiation rite, a test of endurance that separated those who would stay from those who would give up. It's interesting to note how the body acclimated to the discomfort. After months in the workshop, the blacksmith was no longer bothered by the smoke, as if he had made peace with it. The same thing happens in our modern routines. We become accustomed to the noise of traffic, the stress of work, the incessant notifications. What once bothered us becomes just part of the scenery over time. The smoke, in a way, was a silent adaptation training, but there was also a symbolic side. The smoke rising from the workshop's chimney was visible throughout the village. For the residents, it was a reassuring sign. It meant the blacksmith was active, that tools were being made, that the cycle of life continued to be protected. It's curious to think that just as today we look at a light in a shop as a sign of operation, back then it was enough to see the smoke rising. It was the simplest and most effective form of communication possible, and there were long-term consequences. Daily contact with the smoke took its toll on the blacksmith's health. Constant coughing, shortness of breath, premature fatigue. Yet few complained. It was as if they accepted the invisible burden in exchange for the importance their work held for everyone. This silent surrender reveals how willing they were to sacrifice for the common good, a sacrifice that ironically almost no one noticed. But besides the smoke, there was another equally constant risk, the danger of burns, always lurking in every hurried movement within the forge. Medieval blacksmiths faced the daily risk of burns. The fire, always intense, forgave no distractions. All it took was one false move, one careless touch to the red-hot iron, and their skin would be permanently scarred. Scars were common on the arms and hands of artisans, visible signs of a life dedicated to their craft. Each mark told a story, as if the skin itself were a book, written by fire. Apprentices often went through this ordeal in their first few months. No matter how attentive they were, it was inevitable that a spark would fly, or they would touch a still hot piece. The master, instead of reprimanding, would simply say, "Now you'll never forget." It was a harsh way of teaching, but it worked. After all, certain lessons need to be engraved in the body so they won't be erased from memory. The burns weren't just physical. The smell of charred skin, mixed with the already strong odor of the workshop, created a heavy and uncomfortable atmosphere. Some residents avoided entering the space precisely because of this combination of heat and acrid smell, but for the blacksmith, this was just part of life's routine. He learned to live with the pain and the small accidents, like someone who learns to live with the obstacles in life's path. Interestingly, this makes us think about how we have a very different relationship with failure today. We strive for instant perfection. We want to avoid any failure. The blacksmith, however, knew that failure was inevitable and that it left scars. These scars, however, were not a source of shame, but of experience. It's like in the modern world. Entrepreneurs who fail in their first ventures often carry invisible scars, but these scars make them better prepared for the next challenge. And then there was the issue of pride. Many blacksmiths saw their scars as a kind of silent medal. They were painful reminders, true, but also proof that they had endured the fire and kept going. This created a kind of aura of respect. The man marked by the iron was also the one who knew how to tame it. A harsh lesson, but one that transformed pain into Yet the blacksmith didn't just work with metal and fire. His craft connected him directly to people, especially the farmers and shepherds who knocked on his workshop's door with pleas for help, bringing new stories and new needs to shape. The blacksmith didn't work in isolation from the world, though his workshop was small and smoky. In fact, he was deeply connected to the village rhythm, especially that of the farmers and shepherds. These men and women were his most frequent customers, bringing broken tools, bent plows, and worn horseshoes. The bond between them was more than commercial. It was almost a silent partnership for survival. Farmers depended on the blacksmith to keep the harvest cycle going. A dull hoe meant delayed planting, and a broken plow could jeopardize the entire harvest. The blacksmith knew this and often prioritized certain repairs to avoid putting the village at risk of starvation. This sensitivity demonstrated that his work was not only technical, but also human. He understood that each repaired item was, ultimately, a guaranteed plate of food. Shepherds, in turn, needed horseshoes for their animals, keys for gates, and even small objects to secure their flocks. They were frequent customers, always knocking on the workshop's door. The relationship with them had a certain familiarity, short conversations, quick exchanges, but full of trust. Today, we can compare this to the bond with that local mechanic who knows our car better than we do, a relationship built on daily basis, not on contracts. These gatherings were also moments for exchanging stories. While waiting for the iron to heat, farmers would tell of pests threatening their crops. Shepherds would recount difficulties with wolves or long treks in search of pasture. The blacksmith, in turn, would offer advice, make discreet jokes, and share experiences. The workshop thus became a small meeting place, a space for community within the village. Interestingly, this relationship went beyond economics. Farmers and herders often lacked the coin to pay for their services, and the exchange was made in food, milk, wool, or meat. This practice created even stronger bonds because the payment was not only material but symbolic. It was a way of keeping the community united around a cycle of mutual aid, and deep down, everyone knew the blacksmith's work sustained the field, and the field sustained the blacksmith. But exchanges didn't always involve coins or food. Often, the blacksmith would accept as payment only the promise that he would soon receive what was owed to him. This logic of trust reveals a fascinating aspect of medieval life, the economy of words. In medieval villages, money rarely circulated in abundance. The economy was simple, almost rudimentary, and so the blacksmith often received payment in food rather than coins. A bucket of fresh milk, a sack of grain, a piece of salted meat, all of these were worth as much as a few silver coins. For him, what mattered was not the shine of the coins, but the sustenance that guaranteed his family's survival. This practice reinforced the idea of community. The blacksmith knew that by accepting a measure of flour, he was directly participating in the bread that would be baked the next day. It was as if the work on the anvil was transformed indirectly into food on the table. This cycle created an invisible connection between all the residents, where each act of work reverberated in the collective life. It's interesting to consider that this exchange system, called barter, also taught something about trust. The value of a piece of iron wasn't fixed, but negotiated according to need and availability. If a farmer had an abundance of wheat that year, he paid with wheat. If the pasture was better, he received milk. This flexibility maintained the village's balance. Today, with all our financial sophistication, we still seek something similar when exchanging services between friends or neighbors. This way of life also brought simplicity to relationships. There were no long discussions about interest deadlines or contracts. Agreements were direct, face to face, and based on reputation. If the blacksmith delivered a good tool, he knew he would receive food in return. If someone was late in paying, it wasn't a bank that charged, but the collective conscience of the village, which brooked no breach of trust. The currency was, above all, the given. It's worth remembering that for the blacksmith, this type of payment also had a practical aspect. Saving coins could be difficult and even dangerous, but storing sacks of barley or chunks of cheese meant immediate security. It was the certainty that the family would have enough to eat in the coming days. This logic shows how, in that era, survival was always closer to basic needs than to the abstract accumulation of wealth. But while the payment method was simple, the pace of work was far from light. The blacksmith spent hours in the workshop, often from sunrise to sunset, repeating exhausting movements that shaped not only the iron, but also its own strength. The blacksmith would start early, almost always before sunrise. The first step was to light the fire, feed it with charcoal, and prepare the bellows. While the village was still slowly waking, his workshop was already alive, illuminated by the orange glow of the forge. The day had barely begun, and the heat was already intense, announcing that the next few hours would be filled with sweat, repetition, and patience. The workdays stretched into the evening, sometimes into the night. The work was unhurried, but also without long pauses. Each piece required constant attention, and time seemed to blur between the blowing of the bellows, the rhythm of the hammer, and the cracking of the iron. To the outside observer, it seemed monotonous. To the blacksmith, it was a continuous flow, a cycle from which there was no escape. Physical exhaustion was inevitable. The blacksmith's body grew accustomed to carrying heavy iron, enduring the heat of the forge and the pain of his calloused hands. However, even tired, he knew that stopping meant leaving the village without tools, without horseshoes, without security. The work was almost a priesthood, a silent devotion to the collective good. And so, even exhausted, he continued until the last spark had died out. Interestingly, this rhythm reminds us of the modern life of those who undertake or take on great responsibilities. The hours seem endless, the days blur together, and rest seems forever postponed. Yet it is this dedication that builds something lasting. The medieval blacksmith knew no weekends or holidays. His time off was only when the coal ran out or when his body truly could take no more. It was a harsh lesson in discipline, and there was an emotional detail. Despite the fatigue, there was also pride. Each completed piece, each repair delivered, was proof that the effort was worth it. The sound of the anvil wasn't just work, it was also a reminder that the village's life continued steadfastly thanks to his dedication. The blacksmith might not have had public recognition, but he carried within himself the silent certainty of his importance. But he wasn't always alone on these long journeys. At his side, young apprentices shared the burden of the craft, slowly learning the secrets of forging in a process that could take years to form a true master. The apprentice entered the blacksmith's workshop as a young man, often a teenager. His first contact wasn't with the hammer, but with the bellows, drawing and pushing air to keep the fire alive. It was a tiring, repetitive, almost thankless task, but it was precisely in this effort that he began to forge not only iron, but also the patience and discipline necessary to become a true craftsman. Learning didn't happen in weeks or months, but in years. The master's every gesture was observed, repeated, and corrected countless times. The young man learned to wait, to make mistakes, and to try again. It was a harsh pedagogy, based more on repetition than on words. Knowledge was transmitted in the rhythm of the fire, the sound of the hammer, the attentive gaze on the incandescent red of the metal. There was also a human side to this process. The apprentice learned not only to shape iron, but also to live with frustration, a broken iron, a poorly made piece, an unexpected burn. All were part of the lesson. The master rarely offered consolation. Instead, he offered the opportunity to try again. And little by little, the young man realized true learning lay not in avoiding mistakes, but in persisting despite them. This journey is very reminiscent of the training for any modern trade. Anyone who wants to master a profession must accept that the beginning will be hard and slow. Think of someone learning to play the guitar. Their fingers ache, the strings go out of tune, and the melody seems distant. But with daily practice, the sound improves until it becomes music. So it was with the blacksmith's apprentice. The awkward noise of the beginning, over time, became harmony on the anvil. And there was something even deeper, the transmission of values. The master taught not only how to shape iron, but also how to respect work, value patience, and understand the impact of each piece on the life of the community. Over the years, the young man learned not just a technique, but also a philosophy of life. And that's why many apprentices, even without becoming masters, carried the workshop's teachings forever. But in the midst of this long process, there was one fundamental detail that every apprentice needed to master, a keen eye for the color of the metal, capable of indicating the exact moment when the iron was ready to be molded. The medieval blacksmith had no thermometers, digital sensors, or any other precise measuring instrument. His gaze was the only tool capable of indicating whether the iron was ready to be worked. The color tone was the guide. From dark red to bright orange, each nuance conveyed a signal. The craftsman knew that, upon reaching the intense yellow, the iron was malleable enough to yield to the hammer. It was an intuitive knowledge, cultivated over years of practice. The apprentice, at first, saw only fire and glowing iron, but the master saw a whole spectrum of meaning hidden in the hues. This skill didn't emerge suddenly. It was developed through patience and error. Often a blow struck too soon would crack the piece. Other times, overheated iron would become brittle. Each flaw was a silent reminder that color was the secret language of the forge. Interestingly, this trained eye resembles that of modern professionals in other fields. A cook, for example, knows by smell and color when a dish is cooked to perfection. A bricklayer can tell by the hue of cement whether it's ready for use. In every craft, there are details invisible to the naked eye, but clear to those who practice daily. The medieval blacksmith, in this sense, was an artist of observation. This lesson also extended beyond the workshop. The blacksmith learned to read signs in life, not just in iron, the color of the sky before rain, the sound of burning wood, the look of a worried customer. Everything became language. The workshop trained not only the hands, but also the sensitive perception of subtle things. It was as if shaping iron also taught how to shape the way we see the world. For the village, this technical detail was invisible, but fundamental. The peasant received the finished hoe without imagining how many times the blacksmith had had to observe, wait, and test until he got the timing right. And that's precisely where the greatness of the craft lies, transforming patience into results, transforming a watchful eye into a useful tool for all. This wisdom, silent and often unnoticed, sustained the community's daily life. And when the iron finally reached the exact point, it was cooled in cold water in a shock that released smoke and hisses, creating a striking scene that announced the next stage of the process. When the iron emerged from the forge, glowing red and glowing, the blacksmith plunged the piece into a bucket of cold water. The thermal shock was immediate. A cracking sound, a high-pitched hiss, and a cloud of steam filled the air. This process, called tempering, was not just a visual spectacle, it was the step that ensured the metal's hardness and resistance. Without it, the piece would be fragile, unable to bear the weight of daily work. The tempering process always caught the attention of apprentices. Many were fascinated by the dramatic effect of the steam, as if the iron were screaming as it was immersed. For the master, however, there was no glamour, only technique. The immersion time was calculated instinctively. Too many seconds could make the piece brittle. Too few seconds would make it too soft. It was a delicate balance, learned only through experience. Interestingly, this contrast between fire and water offered a powerful metaphor for life. Iron, like humans, needed to endure extremes to gain strength. Just as the piece emerged stronger from the impact, so too did people become more resilient after facing hardship. It was a silent lesson hidden in the steam of the workshop, teaching that pain and transformation often go hand in hand. The village, even without understanding the technique, noticed the results. A tempered hoe lasted longer, a horseshoe resisted rocky roads better, a sword held its edge longer. For the peasants and shepherds, the sizzle of tempering was almost a sign of hope. It meant another reliable tool was about to return to their hands. This sound, though brief, was awaited like one waiting for good news. Today, we have electric furnaces, controlled oil baths, and sophisticated techniques for hardening metals. But back then, it all came down to fire, water, and accumulated experience. And even with such simplicity, the results have sustained generations. This reminds us that complexity isn't always necessary. Sometimes the simplest methods, when mastered well, can guarantee lasting achievements. And after the steam dissipated and the piece was removed from the water, the familiar sound of hammer against anvil returned, a sound that echoed throughout the village, reminding everyone that the work never stopped. In the routine of the medieval village, there was a sound that repeated itself day after day, the blacksmith's hammer. It echoed morning, afternoon, and often until nightfall. This metallic, rhythmic, and insistent noise became part of the village soundscape. For some, it was disturbing. For others, it was reassuring, a sign that the work was being done and that life was continuing as normal. Children played nearby, listening to the distant sound, accustomed to this never-changing background music. Farmers, returning from the fields, knew they could locate the workshop simply by following the metallic echo. The hammer, in this sense, was almost like a church bell. It marked time, dictated the cadence of the days. It was impossible to separate the village from the constant beat coming from the heart of the forge. Interestingly, this sound also carried a sense of security. As the hammer resounded, everyone knew tools were being repaired, horseshoes prepared, doors reinforced. The echo was a silent reassurance that the community was not abandoned, and it's interesting to note how we have something similar today. The hum of machines in a factory, the clatter of keyboards in an office, engines and traffic. Every era has its own symphony of work. For the blacksmith, sound was not just background music, but a guide. Each strike revealed whether the metal was at the right point, whether the shape was coming out as planned. The trained ear picked up details that a layman would never notice. It was as if each piece had its own melody, and the blacksmith, like conductor, knew how to guide the hammer until the music was complete. But there was also an emotional toll. The repetitive sound could be exhausting, but also meditative. Many blacksmiths said that amidst the beating, they entered an almost trance like state, forgetting time. The body worked, but the mind wandered. This experience is very reminiscent of current active meditation practices, in which the repetition of a simple gesture leads to states of deep concentration. And despite all this symbolism, the sound of the anvil didn't bring enough prestige. The blacksmith, though so essential, occupied only a moderate place in the village hierarchy, respected but rarely celebrated. The blacksmith was undoubtedly indispensable, but his prestige in the village was not commensurate with the importance of his craft. He was above a simple manual laborer, but below figures like the priest, the local lord, or even some merchant. He was respected for his work, but rarely celebrated as a hero. His relevance was practical, everyday, and not symbolic. And this gave him a peculiar position, recognized, but not in social life. The blacksmith attended the same parties, the same masses, the same community gatherings. However, he was rarely called upon to lead or give his opinion on major decisions. His voice carried weight when the topic was work, but not when it involved politics or religion. He was seen more as a necessary cog than as a pillar of leadership. This made him someone to be trusted, but never to be singled out for prominence. This intermediate position generated ambiguous feelings. On the one hand, the blacksmith lived with a certain stability, as everyone depended on him. On the other, he never achieved the privileges of those in power. It was as if he were a perpetual backstage worker, essential but invisible to the eyes of glory. This dynamic is repeated to this day in many professions. Think, for example, of the technicians who keep power systems or the internet running. We only remember them when something fails. There was, however, a quiet respect. Many villagers admired the blacksmith's strength and endurance, even if they didn't express it publicly. Children saw him as an almost mythical figure, capable of mastering fire and metal, and even though he received no honors, the look of trust that farmers and shepherds gave him was in itself a form of prestige. After all, there wasn't a house in the village that didn't have something made by his hand. Interestingly, this moderate prestige also protected him. By not being at the center of power, the blacksmith escaped certain rivalries and political conflicts. His position was secure because his usefulness was unquestionable. It was a practical, not vain prestige that kept him firmly in the community. And in a way, this discretion was even advantageous, as it allowed him to work in peace without pressure to be great. Still, as secure as his position was, the blacksmith faced constant challenges. One of the greatest was the difficulty of obtaining quality raw iron, a scarce resource that limited his production and increased his worries. One of the greatest challenges for medieval blacksmiths was securing raw iron to work with. Unlike today, with large-scale mining and global metal trade, access to iron was limited and uncertain. Often they relied on small, rudimentary local deposits or trade with travelers who brought blocks from far away. Scarcity made each piece of iron precious, treated almost like a treasure. This hardship, directly impacted village life. Without sufficient iron, tools took longer to produce, repairs were delayed, and even safety was compromised. The blacksmith had to be creative, making use of every scrap. Every scrap. He often melted down pieces of broken iron to form a new piece. This ability to reuse was as important as that of molding, as survival depended on conserving resources. There was also the issue of quality. The available iron wasn't always pure and often contained impurities that weakened the pieces. The blacksmith had to work twice as hard, hammering more often, reinforcing weak points, trying to extract the best possible from the material. It was a constant exercise in adaptation, a daily struggle against the limitations of the raw material. And this required not only technique, but also almost infinite patience. Interestingly, this reality closely resembles what we experience in modern situations of scarcity. Think of entrepreneurs who start with few resources and need to make the most of every penny invested, or of families who improvise creative solutions when faced with a lack of funds. The medieval blacksmith was exactly that, a master of improvisation, someone who transformed limitations into opportunities. But despite all this hardship, there were moments of hope when itinerant traders appeared in the village. These travelers brought iron from other regions, allowing the blacksmith to replenish his stock. Each arrival was almost a festive event, as it meant more tools, more repairs, and greater peace of mind for the community. The sound of the anvil resounded with renewed force whenever fresh iron arrived, and it is precisely at this point that we realize that the blacksmith was not isolated. He depended heavily on trade and external exchanges to keep his workshop alive. This connection with travelers showed that, even in small villages, the outside world was always present. The medieval blacksmith, despite his importance in the village, was not self-sufficient. He often depended on itinerant traders who passed through from time to time, bringing raw iron, extra charcoal, specialized tools, and even novelties from other regions. These travelers were like bridges between distant worlds, and without them the workshop would be paralyzed. Each arrival was eagerly awaited, as it meant a chance to replenish scarce supplies. Traders also brought more than just goods. They brought news, stories, and rumors from distant lands. For the isolated village, this was invaluable. The blacksmith, when trading iron or coal, heard reports of wars, discoveries, and changes in metal prices. These conversations shaped not only his work, but also his worldview. The workshop thus became not only a production center, but also a point of contact with the outside world. This dependence, however, had its risks. If traders were slow in arriving, the blacksmith would run out of raw materials, and the village would suffer. Imagine a harvest about to begin, but without sharp tools, simply because the iron hadn't arrived. The entire community's rhythm could be disrupted by the absence of a traveler. This created a constant vulnerability, a feeling that the future always hung in the balance. Interestingly, this logic isn't so far removed from us. Today, entire cities depend on supply trucks, loaded ships, or complex logistics systems. A transportation strike or a roadblock is enough for supermarkets to be empty within days. The difference is that in the Middle Ages, the scale was smaller, but the fragility was the same. The blacksmith, therefore, learned to value each merchant's visit as a precious commodity. Furthermore, this relationship with travelers expanded their repertoire of techniques. Often, merchants would bring finished pieces made in other regions, and the blacksmith could analyze them, learn new shapes, and adapt innovations to their own needs. It was a kind of silent exchange that enriched the craft with new ideas. The world, even distant, became present through the hands of those who crossed dusty roads carrying goods. And among the objects that most marked this daily life were those intended not for war, but for simple village life. Locks, keys, hinges, seemingly small items, they carried enormous value for the comfort and safety of families. The blacksmith's work wasn't limited to large tools or weapons. Often, his day was filled with crafting seemingly simple household objects, yet essential to the village daily routine. Keys, hinges, locks, and small latches emerged from his anvil and found practical use in wooden houses. These details, invisible to most, were what ensured sturdy doors, safe chests, and sturdy windows. Keys, in particular, carried special symbolism. Having a key meant having something to protect, whether it was a barn, a chest of grain, or a coin box. The blacksmith, as he shaped each iron cog, delivered not only an object, but also a promise of security. In the simplicity of the village, the small piece of metal represented privacy, control, and to some extent power. Hinges, in turn, were the silent soul of doors and gates. Without them, there was no fluid movement, just heavy wood dragged with effort. The blacksmith knew that the comfort of a home depended on these discrete mechanisms, just as we today are irritated by a creaky door. Back then, the villager deeply valued the well-done work that allowed them to open and close their homes effortlessly. It's curious to realize how these small objects carried enormous significance. While the sword or the plow were visible symbols of power and sustenance, the key and the hinge represented everyday life, the intimate space of each family. They were less glamorous pieces, but they defined daily well-being. This logic remains with us today. We value our car or our house, but we forget the importance of locks, screws, and the small details that make everything function. The blacksmith also infused these pieces with a touch of creativity. Many keys were given unique shapes, almost like signatures, which made copying difficult and increased security. It was the security technology of the time, created not with computers, but with fire and a hammer. This shows how, even in the most basic needs, there was always room for innovation. But the workshop wasn't limited to the domestic sphere. In addition to working for homes and families, the blacksmith also played a central role in larger village events, such as fairs and community gatherings, where his wares circulated and gained even greater social value. Medieval fairs were moments of gathering, trade, and celebration. For the blacksmith, these events were of enormous importance. They were an opportunity to showcase his work beyond the village, trade with strangers, and strengthen his standing in the community. At his makeshift stall, he displayed nails, horseshoes, keys, hinges, and sometimes even small blades. Each piece gleamed in the sunlight as proof of his skill and dedication. The fair was not only a space for sales, but also for recognition. There, the villagers saw firsthand the results of the workshop's daily efforts. Often, customers from other villages arrived interested in commissioning specific works, spreading the blacksmith's name beyond local borders. This contact expanded his network of relationships and gave him a sense of belonging to something greater than the small village where he lived. Beyond trade, the fairs were a stage for cultural exchange. The blacksmith would meet other artisans, see new techniques, and learn different tool shapes. Sometimes he would carefully observe a foreign blade model or a more elaborate hinge. mentally recording the details to later test in his workshop. These encounters functioned as veritable informal schools, where every curious glance turned into a learning experience. There was also a human side that couldn't be ignored. Participating in the fair meant escaping the heavy routine of the workshop, breathing fresh air, and talking to different people. For the blacksmith, accustomed to the smoke and the noise of the anvil, this moment brought a sense of freshness, almost a relief. It was like a break from the exhausting flow, even as he continued working. The fair was work, yes, but also a celebration, with music, food, and laughter. Interestingly, the blacksmith's presence at the fair also strengthened his image within the village. Seeing his pieces being valued by outsiders increased the respect of his neighbors. It was a way of demonstrating that his work had value beyond local borders. This recognition, however subtle, fueled the artisan's pride and motivated him to continue enduring the long days at the forge. But if the fair brought recognition, the workshop soon began to exact its toll. The blacksmith's body, subjected to repetitive movements and heavy loads, began to show clear signs of physical wear and tear over the years. The blacksmith's body was as scarred as the iron he shaped. Years of repetition took their toll. Aching shoulders, a bent back, calloused hands, and scarred fingers. Each hammer blow left marks not only on the anvil, but also on the artisan's body. The workshop, with its heat and weight, slowly transformed vitality into permanent fatigue. It was a craft of strength, but also of silent endurance. The apprentices, at first, rarely realized this cost. Fascinated by the fire and the sound of the hammer, they imagined only the heroic part of the work. But as the years passed, their bodies began to show warning signs. Constant pain, limited movement, vision affected by the smoke. Many blacksmiths aged prematurely, with firm muscles but riddled with invisible internal wounds. It was the invisible price of keeping the village running. Yet there was a dignity to it. The blacksmith carried his scarred body as proof of his devotion to his craft. The villagers, looking at his calloused hands, saw in them confirmation of his usefulness. It was a kind of silent recognition, unlike the medals and honors reserved for warriors. While soldiers bore battle scars, the blacksmith displayed the scars of daily life, and both held equal value to the community. This wear and tear is very reminiscent of modern professions that require daily repetition. Think of factory workers, long-distance drivers, or even office workers, hunched over computers for hours on end. Each, in their own way, also pays the price of repetitive movements. The medieval blacksmith, therefore, is a timeless portrait of human sacrifice in exchange for progress. Despite everything, many accepted this burden without complaint. There was a certain resignation, almost a silent pact with fate. For the blacksmith, pain was part of the trade, as were fire and smoke. There was no glamour, only the certainty that each hammer blow brought the village closer to survival. It was a painful but inevitable strain, as if written into the invisible contract of labor. And in times of greater turmoil, when war was at hand, this exhaustion was even more demanding. The demand for weapons increased, and the blacksmith had to work twice as hard, putting aside his pain to meet the community's needs. As the shadow of war approached, the blacksmith's workshop changed its rhythm. What had been steady but moderate work became urgent. Hammers clanged late into the night, the fire burned relentlessly, and the blacksmith barely had time to breathe. Swords, spears, arrowheads, and horseshoes piled up like never before. Each completed piece meant a new chance of survival for the men who would go into combat. The pressure was immense. It wasn't just about repairing farm tools or making door hinges, but about delivering instruments that would decide life or death. The blacksmith felt the weight of each order, aware that his work was turning into bloodshed on the battlefield. This responsibility, though silent, weighed more heavily than the iron in his hands. It was like carrying the fate of the entire community on his shoulders. Interestingly, war also brought a contradiction. On the one hand, it increased demand, and with it, prestige and even payments. On the other, it brought pain, loss, and the destruction of the very community the blacksmith helped protect. He found himself trapped in this paradox. His skill was most valued when the world around him was crumbling. It was the bittersweet glory of being needed in times of chaos. To cope with the overload, the blacksmith often called on more apprentices or asked for help from strong men in the village. The workshop became a space of collective effort, where everyone worked together to produce as much as possible in a short amount of time. The sound of hammers echoed relentlessly, mixed with the crackling of the fire and the hissing of the tempering. It was an environment of exhaustion, but also of unity. Each blow seemed to carry a silent plea for survival. This scenario is repeated, to some extent, in modern times. During major crises, be it a war or a pandemic, previously common professions gain immense value. Doctors, scientists, engineers, and even basic service workers become seen as discreet heroes. The medieval blacksmith represented exactly this, an ordinary worker who in times of emergency became an indispensable pillar. But the war passed, and life returned to its usual rhythm. And when peace was restored, the workshop returned to its most intimate role, passing on the craft from generation to generation, keeping alive the tradition that sustained the village. The blacksmith's craft was rarely learned from books. It passed from father to son, from master to apprentice, like a secret kept in the flames of the forge. The son grew up hearing the sound of the anvil, feeling the heat of the fire, and watching his father transform raw iron into something useful. Even before he held a hammer, he carried the smell of smoke in his body and the responsibility of continuing the family work in his heart. This transmission was not only technical, but also values. The son learned patience, discipline, and humility by observing his father. Each repeated gesture, each silent lesson, shaped not only his hands, but also his character. It was a practical education rooted in everyday life that taught more than words could explain. In the forge, one learned to live as much as to work. Often the child would begin with small tasks, fetching water, stacking coal, organizing tools. Gradually, they would take on larger responsibilities until finally picking up the hammer and feeling the true weight of the craft. This slow progression demonstrated that nothing of value comes immediately. The blacksmith's knowledge was like the iron he forged. It required heat, time, and repetition to gain shape and strength. Interestingly, this kind of inheritance wasn't limited to iron. The son also inherited the stories told at the forge, the conversations with farmers, the lessons of trust and fair exchange. He learned that his work wasn't isolated, but connected to everyone's survival. It was a community learning experience in which each piece produced carried the weight of collective responsibility. This cycle of transmission reminds us of how we pass on values within our families today. It may no longer be the craft of iron, but we still pass on beliefs, habits, and traditions that shape who we are. Whether it's a taste for a dish, a love for a team, or dedication to a job, All of this is a silent inheritance, passed down through simple gestures. The medieval blacksmith simply immortalized this in the sound of the anvil and the heat of the fire. And so, as generations passed, the blacksmith's craft remained alive. The tradition spans centuries, shaping not only iron, but also the history of villages. And it is in this continuous thread of transmission that the perfect foundation is born to connect this entire past to the way we understand work and life today.